welcome. I'm Jane Vossler, and I want to welcome everyone on behalf of the Community Senior Center. We're really grateful to the Vermont Humanities Council for giving us a grant to help bring Rolland here. Rolland was with us a year or two ago. We're not quite sure how long ago it was, doing a program on restorative justice in Vermont and Argentina and Rwanda, right countries?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So we're really happy to have Rolland here. He's a professor of history at Norwich University, and he's also director of the history program there. And maybe he'll tell us how he got this connection to baseball too. So over to you, Rolland.
Thank you. Let me make sure I can share my screen. There are a couple different ways I can do that. And let's try for... Okay, can you all see that screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. The disadvantage of this is that I can't see you and my screen at the same time.
Yeah.
So I'll ask Jane if folks have questions. First of all, feel free to interrupt me. Secondly, if you have questions, if Jane, if you could let me know.
Okay.
That would, and then of course we'll have time for discussion at the end. My immersion into baseball was growing up in Cleveland and in the 1980s, where Cleveland was was firmly enmeshed in the Rust Belt, and sports was a way of escape for many folks in Cleveland. Baseball in particular, partially because of its natural rhythm. You know, we tend to be optimistic in the spring about the coming summer, and baseball starts then, and it's a time of optimism for folks in Cleveland about the prospect that the Indians might actually in any given year maybe win more games than they lost, which in the 1980s was always a losing proposition, but it didn't dampen the optimism. And so growing up as a Cleveland fan and having a little transistor radio under my pillow that I would turn down really softly so my parents wouldn't hear me after bedtime was my entryway into the sport, and a way of imagining things that only hearing things on the radio can allow you to do. And if folks listen to baseball games on the radio, you know what I'm talking about in terms of imagining what's happening on the field and hearing the crack of the ball against the bat. It's a timeless sound and way to engage a sport as a symbol of your city. And I teach a history of baseball class at Norwich at least once a year, online and in person. And it's a great way to interact with students, teach them historical skills on a topic that many of them have a personal interest in. So I see it as an entryway, more effective than other topics, maybe, to get them interested in history. So today, I want to talk with you all a little bit about Abner Doubleday. And let me see if can you all still see the screen?
Yes, we can see the screen. We also can see the slides that are down on the side of your screen.
Okay. So yeah, I've got to go back up here. So I won't be able to, if I was in a classroom, I could extend my screen and be able to see both you on one screen and the slides. From a show of hands, and I'll ask Jane if she sees everybody. How many of you have heard of Abner Doubleday, the name?
I'd say there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and I can't see everybody myself, so at least 8.
Okay. Yeah. So how many of you also know for a fact that Abner Doubleday had nothing to do with the invention of baseball?
Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4. I see 4 hands up.
Okay. So there's a good number of people who haven't heard that, which is good because that's sort of the first theme of this. Abner Doubleday had nothing to do with the invention of baseball, but we'll look at why. And that's actually the second question that's more important. When was he given credit for inventing baseball, and why was he given credit at that time? So those are sort of the two main questions that we'll look at today. And it's a fascinating dive into American history and the sport of baseball. To begin with, to sort of set up this topic of deception, this theme of being misinformed, here we have a Under Armour baseball cleat shown as titled Deception. And that's because one might argue that baseball as a sport is based on this specific principle. If you're on the field, your job is to deceive the people on the other team. Pitchers try to disguise their pitches, even doctor baseballs. Batters try to hide where they want to hit the ball and if they're going to bunt or not. Managers and coaches use signs to communicate with those on base, and they try to collaborate to steal the other team's signs. Base runners try to steal bases. All of that's deception on the field. In addition to that, baseball is about fans deceiving themselves. We like even today to view baseball players as sort of heroes, young men playing the game for pure sport, the boys of summer. We have, especially when I was growing up in Cleveland, we deceive ourselves that our team has a chance to be world champions every year. And fans also tend to believe that baseball has a sort of innocent and wholesome history. It's a rural game played in a ballpark. It's the only major sport that doesn't have a time clock, although we might be moving to a pitch clock at some point at the major league level. It's in the lazy summertime. When you go to a baseball game, it's a social event with folks who live near you or folks you came with the game with, as well as watching the game itself. It's a sort of innocent, wholesome family entertainment. And baseball stakeholders, talk about owners, players, Major League Baseball staff, they're all about deception too. So deceiving us that baseball is still America's pastime. And we know from TV ratings and attendance that just isn't so. They assert that the game has remained unchanged over the years, and we can even compare Babe Ruth's stats with anyone alive with Mike Trout's stats because the game is unchanging. And we're taught that the game reflects good values of competition, individualism, and cooperation, right? Individual effort, but in the context of helping your team win. Deception, what we're going to look at today is about two deceptions. First, the false origins of baseball and Abner Doubleday, and second, how that conspiracy of lies led to a second deception, which is the location, the building and location of the Baseball Hall of Fame in Cooperstown, New York in the late 1930s. Now, these aren't evil lies I want to put forward. These are more white lies that create a myth about baseball's origins that's really important. Because baseball, like religion, needs to have a founder and needs to have a birthplace. And if we're not Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, we're Albert Doubleday in Cooperstown, New York. It's a good story. So to reiterate, these are the three questions that I've divided one into two, the three questions that I want to look at today. Where and when, why did baseball's origins matter in 1903, which is the birthplace of the Abner Doubleday myth? And then, do the origins of baseball matter today? So to start with, the first question, Abner Doubleday has no clothes. The myth of Abner Doubleday, there's no evidence upon which to identify Abner Doubleday having anything to do with baseball. But to be fair to Abner Doubleday, I want to be fair to him up front because, as we'll see, he's quite a distinguished American. He never claimed to have invented baseball, and he wasn't given this designation until long after he was dead. So we can't blame him for coming up with this myth. Let's look at 1903 then and find out why he was identified as the person who invented baseball. So 1903 is a really important year for baseball in a couple reasons. First, the National Agreement was signed, what's called the National Agreement, which united the 8-team National League and the 9-team American League into two leagues of organized baseball. The same American League and National League that begin today come out of this agreement in 1903. And there was a commission established to oversee the entire sport. 1903 is then also the first year where the champions of the American League and National League played in the first World Series. The Boston Americans beat the Pittsburgh Pirates in 8 games. And it's also, baseball was really popular then in 1903 because of this organizational stability. Both leagues drew 4.7 million fans. You had very famous baseball players like Cy Young, Sam Crawford, Rube Waddell in the prime of their playing lives. And this popularity led to a dispute between two men who were firmly enmeshed in organized baseball. And the debate was just a personal debate between the two of them over the question of, well, now that baseball's popular, when did it begin? Let's think about or research the origins of baseball. The first answer to this question about who invented baseball was by a man named Henry Chadwick. And Chadwick was born in the United Kingdom. He moved to Brooklyn at the age of 12. He got a job covering cricket, which was also firmly enmeshed in New York City, cricket and baseball for the New York Times in the 1880s, 1890s, early 1900s. He became a baseball enthusiast. He was a tireless promoter of the game as a journalist. He invented the first box score. He invented the letter K as a abbreviation for strikeout. And because of his background in baseball, his enthusiasm for baseball, he was hired by a guy named Albert Spalding, who we'll get to next, to edit, as you see on the right there, Spalding's official indoor baseball guide. Think of it as if you grew up in the 1970s and 80s as the Sporting News, the official Bible of baseball, including stories about baseball, annual statistics, many biographies of baseball players. This is like the official guide for baseball fans, and Chadwick is the editor of this. Chadwick is an Anglophile, being born in Great Britain, and so he argued that baseball derived from a British sport called rounders. And the only evidence he used is that which you see in the second bullet point, that there are some similarities in the layout, the rules, and positions of rounders in Great Britain and baseball in America. 4 bases, 9 fielders. There's something called a pitcher. In cricket, the pitcher bowls. In baseball, the pitcher pitches. The batter runs between bases. That's all the evidence that we need. In fact, in 1888, Chadwick said, quote, "There is no need of presenting any arguments in this case, as the connection between rounders and baseball is too plain to be mistaken." So that's one answer. There was no real inventor of baseball. Baseball was a derivation of the British game of rounders brought to the colonies, and then over several decades, it became the sport of baseball originating in New York City. The second answer was by Chadwick's boss, the publisher of the Spalding Guide, who was also, previous to that, a star pitcher, manager, and owner of the sporting goods store. So if you all use any Spalding baseball equipment or equipment for other sports, that's Albert Spalding's company. Spalding is both a patriotic American and a good businessman who argues that against Chadwick and argues that baseball is an American invention. It was born and bred in the United States, no foreign influence. And one might argue that he came up with this thesis because he's got 3 goals that he has for the sport of baseball. First, he wants to popularize it as a sport that builds good moral and physical character in boys, and by making it an American sport, then participating in baseball as a young man can be patriotic. Secondly, he wants to make money as a sporting goods supplier. He wants to sell people bats, balls, and gloves. And so also tying baseball as an American convention can turn it into America's pastime, and that could increase his own profits. And third, as a patriotic American in 1903, the United States and Great Britain are competing for global power and influence. And so trying to tie a national sport to Great Britain is not terribly popular if Great Britain is also your international competitor for prestige and economic power. So Spalding says no, baseball is an American invention, but he doesn't have evidence. Nonetheless, in his own column in the Sporting Guide in 1903, Spalding wrote, "I hereby challenge the grand old man of baseball," meaning Chadwick, "to produce his proofs and demonstrate in some tangible way, if we can, that our national game derived its origins from rounders." And
Excuse me, Roland. Excuse me. Do you mean to be on the first slide?
No, it should be continuing on.
Okay, so now we're on Albert Spalding.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, did that just switch, or has that been up?
Only the first slide has been up.
Oh, okay. So here is Henry Chadwick. You can see Chadwick and the cover of, thank you for chiming in. There you see the cover of Spalding's guide that Spalding published, but Chadwick edited. And here's Spalding then. So Spalding publishes this sentence, and Chadwick says in the same issue in his own column, quote, "He means well, but he don't know," referring to Spalding. So Spalding and Chadwick go back and forth in the Spalding guide and in person. They know each other, they like each other, but they have this disagreement. And finally, in 1906, Spalding says, "Look, I want to settle this debate once and for all." So Spalding asks a friend of his, a guy by the name of Abraham Mills, if he could chair an official commission of inquiry into baseball's origins. Now, it's important to note two things. First, Abraham Mills solidly believed that baseball was an American invention. So Spalding is appointing Mills, knowing that Mills already agrees with him. And secondly, Spalding gives the evidence that Spalding has already collected to the Mills Commission. Where did this evidence come from? Well, a year before, in 1905, Spalding had placed advertisements in newspapers across the United States, essentially saying, hey, if any of you all know where baseball began, if you've got any family history of playing baseball, or you know about where baseball began, here's my address, send me a letter. And the guy on the right reads this in the Denver newspaper where Abner Graves is living. And he says, okay, I have some information. So on April 3rd, 1905, Abner Graves, the guy on the right, sends a letter to Albert Spalding and says, here is the evidence that I have. When I was a young boy in a place called Cooperstown, New York, in 1839, I was 5 years old, and I remember hanging out by the general store in Cooperstown, and a man came by. And he showed us, us young boys were playing a game of marbles. He stopped us, and he drew a line in the dirt, and it was the shape of a baseball field. And he taught us the rules in 1839, 1840 about how to play this game. And I think then baseball began in Cooperstown, and that's the origin story. So imagine you're being Albert Spalding for a sec, 1905. You've been having this debate with Henry Chadwick over the origins of baseball. You believe baseball is invented by Americans. This letter arrives on your desk from some guy out in Denver, and it seems to be the founding document, perhaps. This is where baseball began. Well, who is this man that Abner Graves said taught he and his young friends outside the general store in Cooperstown, New York? It's Abner Doubleday. Now imagine for a sec, let's go a step further. You're Albert Spalding, you read this letter, Abner Doubleday supposedly invents baseball, and you know Abner Doubleday. In fact, you know Abner Doubleday through your wife for 10 years. Now, on the one hand, you might say, well, why didn't Abner Doubleday tell me this? On the other hand, that's not what Spalding said. Spalding said, aha, I have the evidence, and Abner Doubleday is exactly the kind of person I want identified as the inventor of a sport if I want to make it popular. Because who's Abner Doubleday? Well, Abner Doubleday was born in Ballston Spa, New York. Not close to Cooperstown. He went to West Point, had served in the Mexican War. Abner Doubleday is kind of like Forrest Gump. He's sort of everywhere where important things happen. Abner Doubleday was at Fort Sumter in April of 1861 when the Confederates bombarded that fort to start the Civil War. Abner Doubleday was then in the Union Army at Bull Run, Antietam, and Gettysburg. He retired from the Army as an engineer in 1873. He moved to California, helped design the first cable car railway in San Francisco. He died in 1893 and was buried, as you see in the bottom right photo, at Arlington National Cemetery. So if you want to popularize the sport, you could do far worse than having Abner Doubleday, distinguished American, be supposedly the founder. Now, the only evidence, again, is this letter and a follow-up letter from Abner Graves. But the fix is in. And here's why. If you look at the connections here, you've got Abner Doubleday in the center. Abner Graves is connected to Abner Doubleday through supposedly these childhood reminiscences. Abner Doubleday is connected to Abraham Mills through the letters, because as soon as Spalding receives these letters, he passes them on to Abraham Mills and the Mills Commission. And it just so happens that Abraham Mills knew Abner Doubleday intimately for more than 20 years. In fact, Abraham Mills was a pallbearer at Abner Doubleday's funeral. Now, again, why didn't Abner Doubleday tell Abraham Mills during the decades that they knew each other that he had anything to do with baseball? That's a question best left unanswered. Was there a connection between Albert Spalding and Abner Doubleday directly, other than indirectly through these letters? We don't know, but there's intriguing evidence by John Thorne, who is baseball's official historian, that Abner Doubleday knew Albert Spalding's wife, Elizabeth Spalding, because Elizabeth Spalding was heavily involved in a society called the Theosophical Society in the late 1800s. The Theosophical Society was a kind of spiritualist movement or mystic group based on seeking truth by studying comparative religions, reason, and science to uncover laws of nature that could lead to universal harmony and universal peace. So Elizabeth Spalding is very heavily active in the society. Abner Doubleday is president of this society. So there might have been a personal connection between Elizabeth and Abner. We don't know if they ever met. We don't have any surviving letters directly between them, but there might be a personal relationship between Elizabeth Spalding and Abner Doubleday, and therefore there might also have been a personal relationship between Albert Spalding and Abner Doubleday. So you can see that Abner Doubleday is in the middle of all of these connections suddenly being formulated in an official way under the Mills Commission in 1906. And to no one's surprise then, when the Mills Commission releases its official report, identifies Abner Doubleday as the founder of baseball in Cooperstown, New York. Henry Chadwick would probably have objected vehemently, except he had died a couple months before the release of the Mills Commission. So the Mills Commission is released without any official dissent from Chadwick, and it becomes part of baseball history. Doubleday, again, there's no evidence at all that Doubleday had anything having to do with baseball. If we start to even a surface view of the Mills Commission findings would show that there's no evidence that Doubleday ever visited Cooperstown. In 1839 and 1840, supposedly when he's taught Abner Graves and these other boys in Cooperstown the game of baseball, he was at West Point. And if he was at Cooperstown, he would have been charged with being absent without leave. Abner Doubleday never mentioned baseball in his voluminous diary or 2-volume autobiography. No one ever saw Abner Doubleday play baseball. And again, he died in 1893 before he would be credited with baseball's invention. So he was not alive to fight back against such a connection. Therefore, or despite that, nonetheless, Abner Doubleday is given credit for baseball. And you can see this in several ways. If you go to the Baseball Hall of Fame, there's a baseball field right next to the museum called Doubleday Field. We'll look at what the Doubleday ball means, which is on display in the Hall of Fame. There's a historical marker there that says where baseball was invented and first played in 1839. There's a coin. So that's the answer to the first question. Why Abner Doubleday, or how Abner Doubleday came to be termed the inventor of baseball, without any shred of proof being attached to that claim. And it also answers the second question as to why he's given this credit in the early 1900s in particular, because of organized baseball, Chadwick and Spalding in particular, wanting to add an origin story. And an origin story that's American in origin, not British in origin. The next question then on the slide is, so how do we get from the Abner Doubleday to building the actual Baseball Hall of Fame in Cooperstown, New York? It's not a direct line, though you might think it is. The Mills Commission publishes its findings in 1906. The Baseball Hall of Fame is not built until 1939. And the way we get from Abner Doubleday to the Hall of Fame is a fascinating story involving swearing, womenizing, and orgies. And let me ask, Jane, if you could ask if anybody raises their hand, has anyone ever used a Singer sewing machine? Or have a Singer sewing machine?
3, 4, 5. I think there's 5 or 6 people.
Okay. This is a wonderful story. So in 1851, Isaac Singer had invented a sewing machine, and he, like any good inventor, he wants to patent it to avoid rivals taking up his invention and using it as their own. Now, Isaac Singer had made some money already selling his own sewing machines without a patent. And he used these initial profits to fund quite a larger than life lifestyle. He was a really rough character, used profanity frequently. He was a serial womanizer who engaged in orgies in his house in New York City. He had 20 children by many different women. Very much a larger than life guy who you wouldn't not necessarily identify with something as prim and proper, perhaps as a sewing machine. When he wanted to patent his invention, he turned to a New York lawyer, a friend of his named Ambrose Jordan. But because Jordan was a very upright, rather puritanical figure, and although I shouldn't say they were friends, associates, he did not want to do any more work for Singer once he found out about especially Singer's sexual mores. And so instead, Ambrose Jordan pawned Singer off on his son-in-law, a guy by the name of Edward Clark. And Edward Clark tells Singer, sure, I'll be your lawyer and file your patent. And so you can see there on that slide, Edward Clark and Isaac Singer make a partnership. They become two of the richest men in the United States before going their separate ways. And when they go their separate ways, it means Singer fled the United States because he was charged in New York with bigamy, which was completely false because Singer had 4 wives, not just 2. Going their separate ways also means that Clark left New York City and went to Cooperstown. And why Cooperstown? Because that's where his wife was born and had relatives. So Clark and his wife moved to Cooperstown, New York, and become local philanthropists. And that's where this story might have ended, without anything having to do with any kind of baseball Hall of Fame. Except by the 1930s, Cooperstown was not very healthy as a community. It was not very healthy because the Prohibition had destroyed the local hops industry. This is, again, 1930s, Prohibition on the books, early 1930s and 1920s. The Great Depression had destroyed agriculture in the area. And the only thing really surviving in Cooperstown was this kind of local lore, local legend. And if you all have ever lived in small towns, you know what I'm talking about. Rumors about the town being famous for something or someone living in the town being famous for something. And so there'd been this kind of local lore that baseball had been invented in the town. Stephen Clark, who was Edward Clark's grandson, Stephen Carlton Clark, at that time was living in Cooperstown, and he heard these local stories about Abner Doubleday and Cooperstown and baseball. And he, being an entrepreneurial kind of guy, saw a way to save the town. Why not make the town a tourist destination by associating it with baseball? So he goes to a guy by the name of Ford Frick. Ford Frick is the president of the National League. And he goes to Ford Frick and say, hey, what if we've got a win, I've got a win-win situation. If the National League and myself can partner and build a baseball museum in Cooperstown, that'll draw tourists to the area and it'll drive up national interest in the sport of baseball by preserving its history, preserving its heritage. And Ford Frick said, that's a great idea, but let me build on it. I've just visited a museum which still exists, by the way, today. It's called the Hall of Fame of Great Americans in New York City. You can Google it. There's a website. Frick had just visited this Hall of Fame of Great Americans and said to Stephen Clark, baseball museum's okay, but what if we make a Hall of Fame to baseball's greatest players and have that be the focal point? And Clark said, well, that sounds good to me. That accomplishes my objective. And Frick said, well, that accomplishes my objective. The only thing we need are three things to create this. We need artifacts, we need a building, and we need publicity. And this slide shows all three. So let's start with artifacts. As there is being talk about creating this museum, there's a call out to folks in Cooperstown. Do you all have any artifacts that we can be part of this new museum's collection? And a farmer in nearby Fly Creek, who was living in Abner Graves' former home, found a trunk in his attic, and that included a homemade baseball that was pretty torn and tattered. If you see this picture, you can buy a replica of this torn and tattered baseball on a pedestal at the Baseball Hall of Fame, which I did. And when Stephen Clark then found out about this local baseball dug up in nearby Fly Creek, he dubbed it the Doubleday ball. As I said, Stephen Clark is nothing but entrepreneurial. We'll call it the Doubleday ball. Again, even though there's no evidence that Doubleday had nothing to do with baseball, so it couldn't possibly be his baseball. Nonetheless, but that's one of the first artifacts. Stephen Clark pays $5 for it, for the owner, and it becomes a centerpiece of this new museum. So you start to gather this and other artifacts. Second problem, the building itself. That was solved from 1936 to 1939 over this 3-year period. A museum, Hall of Fame, and a baseball field was built. Of course, the baseball field, as we mentioned, was called Doubleday Field. It was built with funds provided by Stephen Clark himself and the Works Progress Administration, one of the New Deal agencies under Roosevelt. And then it was turned over to a nonprofit to manage. So the Baseball Hall of Fame today is a nonprofit entity. It might surprise some folks. There is no formal affiliation with Major League Baseball. There's a contractual arrangement about distributing memorabilia and that kind of thing. But the Baseball Hall of Fame is a wholly owned nonprofit entity separate from Major League Baseball. For historians, that's problematic because what is in the Baseball Hall of Fame archives are only documents that Major League Baseball allows the Baseball Hall of Fame to have. So you're not going to get a lot of juicy documents about baseball controversies at the Baseball Hall of Fame. Those are firmly in the archives of Major League Baseball, off limits, except without permission to researchers. The third thing then is the publicity, the brouhaha. And the first, you can see it, this picture here, this is the first class inducted into the Hall of Fame in 1939 when the museum was first opened. It includes baseball luminaries like Babe Ruth, Cy Young, Walter Johnson, Honus Wagner, Ty Cobb, Napoleon Lajoie, 11 players inducted in all. In the same year, 1939, both Spalding and Chadwick are inaugurated together in the Hall of Fame as non-players, because you can also have non-players in the Hall of Fame. In fact, today, there are 267 players, 72 executives, umpires, managers, one labor leader. Marvin Miller has just been inducted last year. And 40 to 60,000 people descend on Cooperstown each July for the next class's induction ceremony. 300,000 people visit the Hall of Fame annually. So that's how the Hall of Fame came to be in Cooperstown, New York, because of Isaac Singer and his lifestyle leading to Edmund Clark being hired as his attorney and his grandson happening to his grandson's wife being from Cooperstown, New York, where his grandson settled after leaving New York City. That's how the Baseball Hall of Fame ended up in Cooperstown. I want to end with just a couple questions to consider if baseball wasn't invented by Abner Doubleday. Who invented baseball and when? The historian who's been foremost at trying to uncover this answer is David Block, who's written 2 books if you're interested in this topic. His first book is on the left, Baseball Before We Knew It. He published an update slightly with a lot of revisions, and that's the book on the right, Pastime Lost. His conclusion is that both Spalding and Chadwick are wrong. That not only was baseball not invented by Abner Doubleday, as Spalding says, but baseball did not derive from the sport of rounders either, which is what Henry Chadwick says. It's where baseball came from is really impossible to answer. One reason is that games are rarely invented. Let me give you the exception that proves the rule. We know that James Naismith invented basketball. I think it was in 1890, but I could be off by the year. That is pretty rare. He invented the sport, he wrote the first rules, and we know when the first game was played and where in Springfield, Massachusetts. That's not how most games are invented. Jane, let me ask you for a show of hands. How many of you all, when you were young, played games with a bat or a stick and a ball? And came up with your own rules?
I see 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 people.
Okay. I love asking this. And then I ask my students, did you come up with a name for it? Any name?
I don't see any hands.
Okay. I had one student memorably say, we called it by our last name. We called it I forget his last name, something like Smith Ball or something like that. So games are rarely invented. They are tried, attempted, semi-formalized. Perhaps you invented a bat and ball game and you played with your friends down the block, never caught on. So when you aged out, so did the game. Or perhaps your brothers and sisters learned it and they played with their sets of friends and it evolved differently. So games, sports are similar to that. Natural selection causes some games to survive, some to die out, and some to evolve. If we think that folks in Great Britain in the colonial era were the first to play bat and ball games, let's look at evidence that we do have of European bat and ball games going way back before the time of colonization. Here is, I have my students, when I teach this baseball class, we go out in an afternoon and we play these games to give a sense of how they are. So here's long ball, an example from 13th century Spain. Let me give folks just a second to read the. And what we're doing is we're sort of playing Chadwick's game. Chadwick said, well, rounders and baseball must be connected because they share some similar characteristics. So maybe long ball is a predecessor to what would eventually become baseball. Or what about 1301? There's a reference in a calendar to stool ball from the 11th century. And if you read the rules, there's a little bit of bleeding over into what would become cricket in terms of defending a stool instead of a wicket. Or maybe another piece of the origin story of baseball is 14th century Italy. Drive ball. And drive ball is just a really simple game, just with 2 people. You hit the ball back and forth, and you find out who can hit it the furthest distance. So there you have a game with a bat and a ball. No bases, but a bat and a ball. If not drive ball, maybe we can go to trap ball, where think of this as kind of solo baseball. So you put your foot on the lever that causes the ball to go into the air, and you hit it with a bat. And there are points. And you try to avoid getting out. And there's some ways of getting out on the PowerPoint slide. The first reference to something called baseball that we know of in the colonies is in 1763, which describes a reference to baseball in a 1744 book on children's games. We haven't been able to find, no copy of that 1744 original source exists. But the thing is that baseball we have to be very careful about names, right? Historians have to be very careful. When someone says baseball in 1763, is that anything approaching what will become baseball in the 1840s? Or is it called baseball just because it uses some bases and a ball, which could have nothing to do with what would become known as baseball? One might imagine, for example, you take the name of football, and let's say that me and my sisters had a game that we played with a ball, and we kicked it around, and we called that football because we kicked it. And saying, if an historian were to say 100 years after, wow, those Bruckens must have invented football because they played a game called football, and we have this other game called football. So we've got to be very careful with names. Here's the crux of David Block's argument. And I know this might be a little hard to read. Think of this, if you've seen similar kind of images associated with animal species and natural selection and Charles Darwin, where some species hit a dead end, or not able to reproduce, they die out. Other species evolved from those species. That's David Block's approach with bat and ball games. And I think it's really instructive and really insightful. So he starts on the left with medieval bat and ball games. And think of that as like the primordial soup of bat and ball games. We don't know those bat and ball games, but out of this emerged different families of bat and ball games that would go on in specific categories that we can identify. Now, if you go to the center right of the screen, you'll see this in boldface baseball. And that's the modern game of baseball. So if we go from right to left, you'll see to the immediate left of that is something called the New York game. And if we go back a little bit, you'll see two branches off of that main branch, one that says Philadelphia Town Ball, one that says Massachusetts game. That's because as far as we know, in the 1820s, 1830s, 1840s, there is organized games that are very similar to baseball being played. One game in Philadelphia called Town Ball, one game called baseball in Massachusetts, and a second game called baseball in New York City. The Massachusetts and Philadelphia games will die out. You don't have people playing except in organized leagues around reenacting. But you don't have organized leagues anymore of young people playing town ball or the Massachusetts game. So if we want to find out the origins of baseball, let's keep going back to the left. There you see David Block says baseball, town ball, and round ball. And then he's got two arrows that connect it to English baseball on the bottom and something called 1, 2, 3, 4 Old Cat, and then Tip Cat. So you have these games, you have Tip Cat, 1, 2, 3, 4 Old Cat, and English baseball, all played in the colonies and what's called the early national period of the United States, late 17, early 1800s. And if we go back before then we've got games like the Cat Family, Tut Ball. Here's the thing. Where does rounders fit in according to David Block? Well, if you go south, go below the Massachusetts game, you'll see something called squares, and then you'll see the word rounders. And David Block's guess is that both rounders and baseball both emerge out of something called English baseball, but they do not emerge from each other. In other words, rounders is not the parent of baseball. Rounders is on a different family tree with the same parent as baseball, but that being English baseball. So that's David Block's answer. The problem that we have as historians is that when you think about what people choose to write down about what they're doing in the 17 and 1800s, we've got government records, for example. We have court records, we have probate records, but people just are not writing down the rules to children's games any more than you all wrote down the games that your families played when you were young. And so we don't know the rules of 1, 2, 3, 4 old cat or tip cat, except in very vague references, perhaps in diaries, perhaps in an image that somebody writes down in a newspaper, or again in a diary. In other words, people just aren't in the habit of writing down children's games and the rules of children's games. So that's a problem. And the final problem is this: what is baseball? What is modern day baseball? So even if we go back and say, well, baseball began in the 1840s, and I saw one gentleman who's on this call held up a book by Thomas Gilbert that was just published on the origins of baseball in New York City. Baseball in New York City in the 1840s is different than baseball today. For example, if you wanted to get somebody out, you could hit them with the ball between bases. Or if they hit it to the outfield, they would be out if the outfielder let it bounce once and then caught it. So when I ask what is baseball, that is important to pin down, because that's the only way we can, first of all, have an anchor by which we can then decide when baseball began. If we're talking about baseball as we know it today, with the modern rules, perhaps we say, well, 1973, because that's when the AL, the American League, started the DH. So did baseball begin in 1973? I don't think many folks would agree with that. So let's go back even further. But then that again begs questions as to what are the essential rules that are in place before you say this is when baseball began. As a postscript, the Baseball Hall of Fame has come around to saying, yes, Abner Doubleday did not invent baseball. Instead, we invented Abner Doubleday as the inventor of baseball. So this is the text right now in the Baseball Hall of Fame. And I'll let you read that. And certainly that last part is true. A thriving legend that reflects Americans, including Albert Goodwill Spaulding's desire to make the game our own, meaning American made. So I'll
excuse me, Rowan, there's a question.
Yep.
Don, you have a question?
Yeah, this is all I have to say. Just putting up these 3 questions about where we covered in the last 50 minutes, and that's all that I have. So let me close this. Let me stop sharing my screen so that I can. Okay, I can see everybody. Questions and comments?
Don, you had a question. Don, you're muted.
Oh, boy.
Oh, I heard you earlier. Can you type out your question if you can't? If we can't unmute you. And while Don's doing that, any other questions or comments you want to throw out about this topic or baseball history in general?
I think I'm active now.
Oh, there you go. Yep.
Okay. You'd had that spreadsheet that showed all those games and the derivations. And what were the circumstances under which all of a sudden it was determined we have to formalize this? Was it by any chance when things got monetized and that they felt like, okay, now we got to get serious about this.
So, you're anticipating Thomas Gilbert's book, which I think you're reading now. So another origin story is that the first rules of baseball come from 1845, when a baseball club in New York City called the Knickerbockers gathered in their clubhouse or bar and wrote down the rules of baseball as they had been playing it as amateurs. And so for a long time, historians said, well, that's where the first rules came from. And so they give Thomas Cartwright and Doc Adams and others involved with the New York Knickerbockers credit for inventing baseball. The thing is that just isn't true either. So if we're saying that, yes, they wrote down the rules of baseball, great. No problem with that. Historians would say that's what they did. Are there baseball clubs before them who played under similar rules? Yes. We know that groups like the Atlantic and Excelsiors in Brooklyn were playing neighborhood baseball in the 1820s, 1830s. What the Knickerbockers did was essentially say, we're going to write down the rules because they were aspirational. They were visionaries. They said, look, if we want to play other teams, and that gets to so when we talk about baseball existing in New York City in the 1820s, 1830s, we're talking about groups of New Yorkers, typically in fire engine companies, playing groups among themselves. So there's no reason to write down rules. You and your friends get together and you play just like you have been playing, or you change the rules on the spot and you do the same thing the next thing. What the Knickerbockers had was the aspiration, the hope that this baseball thing might catch on and that their club would actually play other clubs. And once you decide to do that, well, now you need to come up with written rules so that everybody's on the same page. And that's why they wrote those rules in 1845, because they believed they had aspirations of playing other clubs in the same neighborhood.
One can only imagine the game being played with no rules and no umpire.
And you would not have wanted to be that first umpire, because umpires were so the first umpires sat in a chair, what's now on the first baseline. And think of it as like a judge at a figure skating competition. You know, they're seated on the rink and they're there only to settle disputes. Most of the time players would settle disputes among themselves, but if there was no strike zone at this time in the 1840s, so the umpire didn't have to be behind home plate calling balls and strikes. If there was a close play at third base, now the umpire's not anywhere near third base. So the umpire, if the players couldn't resolve it, they would appeal to the umpire, and the umpire would decide, I think Team A has the better argument. So umpires were really abused for their decisions.
And you say this is an American sport, right? And therein lies the root of our litigious society. I'm just kidding.
Yes, baseball was as much as the Victorians tried to save baseball after the Civil War by banning swearing, banning drinking, banning gambling, charging 50 cents to keep the riffraff out from watching games, and putting up stadiums where you had to pay to get in. The origins of baseball lie in the working class New Yorkers, who abused each other and umpires and the ladies of the time who bothered to show up for such a game with such scandalous words. One can only imagine the tender ears of ladies heard.
So I know this isn't exactly what you presented about, but when you mentioned the Baseball Hall of Fame professor, I was wondering if there was any truth to that movie that Tom Hanks was in, where he played a coach of a women's uh, I think it was baseball team that formed during World War II. Were there a bunch of women's baseball teams that formed during World War II, and are they in the Baseball Hall of Fame?
That's a great question. How many folks have seen the movie A League of Their Own? Okay. How many folks have been, by the way, to the Baseball Hall of Fame? Okay. Yeah. Yes. In 1941, Philip Wrigley, owner of the Cubs, baseball players are being drafted or enlisting. I mean, talk about athletes now. These were folks like Bob Feller who willingly gave up the prime of their careers to fight fascism as a duty they felt. And so Philip Wrigley, baseball continued on during World War II, but Philip Wrigley said, I think there's a way of making more money. What if we also form a league of female baseball players, both as, and Philip Wrigley, as a historian of women's rights, you got to be careful about mixed motives. So on the one hand, Philip Wrigley was saying, hey, women can play baseball too. And I want to formulate a league that will give some women the opportunity of playing what is up to now been a man's sport. On the other hand, I want to make this a spectacle as well. And so maybe people will come out because it's so unusual, and we'll make the women players suffer by playing in skirts and lipstick, and require them to have chaperones. And certainly when they're on the road, they are under the care of, the equivalent of a dorm mother. So this vision is both progressive and regressive at the same time. So during World War II, and in fact, up to the early 1950s, the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League will be played. 8 teams, starts out in 1941. And there is a small exhibit at the Baseball Hall of Fame to those women and to the league that Philip Wrigley helps to start. So yes, it is factual. The players' names in the movie are factual. The manager of the Rockford Peaches, Jimmy Breslin, was an alcoholic, one-time famous New York Yankee, washed up, who was given a chance to coach this women's team. It is pretty factual in terms of the historical context.
So this leads me to my next question. The NBA finally sprouted the women's division, and I'm wondering why baseball never sprouted the women's division. Like, why did it become softball? Like, why did softball and baseball become different things, or did they not? Are they related? What are they doing?
That another great question. For those of us who had sort of baseball antenna up in the late 1990s, you might remember the Colorado Coors Light baseball team of women, a baseball league that was that women played baseball in the 1990s. It was a short-lived league and fizzled out because of financial issues. I do not see this. This is, I keep telling my students, I would like one of you to do a paper on the formation of softball and why softball emerged. So I don't have a good answer to that second question of the emergence of softball, first of all, as a sport, and whether it began specifically as a sport for women as an alternative for baseball, or whether it became gendered after its invention. That I don't know.
I'm afraid I have to leave. I have to go to Heinsberg by 3:00. I have to be there, so I'm going to have to check out.
Don, enjoy the Gilbert book. Yes.
I will. I was shocked when I saw this thing. I'm like, wait a minute, I just got this book. Anyway, I'm sorry I didn't get it done before this. And you should do some more conversations, Roland.
Well, thank you. You'll find the book, I think, both mad. I'm not a fan of his prose, but it's you'll find it fascinating. Thank you. Any other comments and questions folks have?
I was wondering about the idea that you pretty much, are saying that the game evolved, and of course now it's evolving still, but all the pushback against, but this is the way it is. I was wondering if you have any thoughts about that.
That is always, you find accounts of people saying you can't wear baseball gloves in the 1870s. We use our bare hands. You can't not allow plugging or throwing the ball at runners and having them out between bases, because we've always played it that. Yeah, you're absolutely right. This is there's this idea, there's this tension in baseball history between what's traditional and how the game should evolve. And you see that today with arguments that baseball doesn't fit into contemporary culture because it takes too long. We have shorter attention spans. So although it's tradition that baseball is played in a certain way, now we need a pitch clock. Now we need limits on how many times a manager can go to the pitcher's mound. We need to find other ways we need to end extra innings and put a runner on second base in the 10th inning, and versus traditionalists. I will say on this, the one debate, which again, if we have baseball next year, the 45-year debate between the AL and the NL over the DH will finally be settled because the National League will have a DH next year. So finally, for the first time since 1973, both leagues will play by the same rules. And to those in the NL who say it's tradition that the pitcher bat versus those who say it's terrible that the pitcher has to bat, this is a theme that you see throughout baseball history. Yes, good insight. Any other questions or comments that you want to make about baseball? I heard that, but I don't speak dog well. Google Translator won't help me.
My dog loves balls and she has a lot of questions, but I don't speak dog either.
Actually, I'm not a dog, but that brings up another question for me. No, I know there are many sports getting added to the Olympics, but I've never heard whether baseball has been added and whether there's Paralympic baseball.
I do not know about Paralympic baseball. Baseball was inserted as an Olympic sport in the 1980s. It was discontinued then, and now it's been reintegrated into the Olympics as a sport. Softball has also been added as an Olympic sport. But baseball was interrupted for a couple Olympics, and I think that this next Summer Olympics will be the first time that baseball is re-added. The United States has not done well in Olympic-wise in baseball, same as it did not do well for a while in basketball, in Olympic basketball. Right now, around 25% of rosters, right now, Major League rosters are international players. Primarily from the Caribbean and Venezuela, Dominican Republic in particular, also Puerto Rico, and Brazil has sent a couple representatives in terms of Major League Baseball. Now we have some Japanese players as well, beginning with Ichiro Suzuki. So baseball is really becoming an international phenomenon. And American players are not necessarily the best in the world, as we'll see when the Olympics come around. The problem is, though, of course, that Americans, the U.S. men's baseball roster will not be the best of American players because the Summer Olympics are in the summer, and that's when baseball is being played. So teams don't want to give up their players to participate in the Olympics, understandably. Mm.
I don't see any other questions. So thank you very much, Rowley. It was really interesting. And I think you need to develop a third talk so we can have you back a third time.
Well, you're very kind. This is I love teaching the baseball history course because it's on one way about baseball, but on the other hand, it's a vehicle for teaching all sorts of other critically important themes in American history, including labor management issues, foreign policy. Baseball becomes an instrument of American foreign policy, race and gender issues in American history, who's allowed to play baseball and who's not. Economics, architecture with baseball stadiums changing, mathematics. My introduction to mathematics was statistics and baseball statistics. And even to this day, that's the only kind of math that really makes sense to me, is statistics. So thank you very much for your patience and your time. And I want to thank Jane and I want to thank George for being in the background in case I had tech issues. So thank you for your very kind invitation.
Thank you for accepting it.
Thank you very much. Wonderful.
Have a wonderful afternoon and be safe.
You too. Bye.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.